So here we are, week 2, org behavior. Welcome. So before we get started, does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns that they'd like to bring up? Okay. So Brian, since you posted in the chat, feel free to just stay in touch because I hear that things can go south kind of quickly. Hopefully it won't, but let me know, okay? All right, I see no hands up. All right, so well done, first week, everybody. So time to dive in some more. I hope all your classes went well last week. You got a good start. You feel settled. You know where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there. But again, if you do have questions, please reach out and I will try to get back to you as quickly as I can. Okay. So this week we are going to talk about some of sort of the entry topics into org behavior. So remember that when we chatted last week, I said organizational behavior is about people within systems like organizations, companies, governments, teams, etc. And all of the issues that occur, both good and bad, when you bring people together. And of course, a goal of an organization is to make good on their mission. And so we are studying this term on the people involved in that, right? So let's start by talking a little bit about how we all have unique vantage points on the world around us. So you can see from this little picture on the left that we all look through our own little lens or telescope and see the world differently. And there's a lot we agree on, but we're also interpreting what's in front of us, either spoken or visual, based on our experiences and our understanding of words and language and body language, all kinds of things. So I put a definition up here. And by the way, a lot of what I'm presenting to you today is outside your textbook. It's meant to build on top of your textbook, although I have brought a few things in from it as well. So this is not meant to take the place of your reading. So here's a definition that I like. This is from a different source. The process of receiving information about and making sense of the world around us, which I think makes is a very clear definition because the sense-making part is really significantly tied in to how we perceive what we're doing. Hold on, I'm gonna let a couple of people in here, so just a sec. All right, so looks like we're here. All right, apologize for the disruption. Hi guys, welcome to class. So the first thing that happens is when we have some sort of sensory event around us, whether it's a sound or something visual or feeling, we decide what we do with that. And in a split second, we are making a determination about what to do with that information, okay? We might ignore it. We might focus in on it heavily, or we may just sort of let it blur in the background. So again, it depends on our experience and how we've been conditioned to respond. So for instance, if a fire alarm went off in your home or business right now, you would probably sit up straight and pay serious attention to it. Now, if a dog barked outside your window, you may or may not. It kind of depends, right? So we decide based on what we call heuristics, which are kind of mental models that we've built over years of just living and experiencing the world around us, and how to categorize different inputs, sensory inputs. And so, and then once we do that, if we decide to, pay attention, we're interpreting it based on our own background, knowledge, etc. Okay, so these mental models we use to decide things like, maybe in grade school, you heard the term stranger danger, right? So, you know that if somebody were to show up at your, in your classroom, walk up to you and put a knife up to you, you would probably take that pretty seriously, and that would trigger off certain mental model responses in your brain, right? About, what to do. And so it keeps us, so these sort of heuristics or models help us break through a lot of stuff, because we're assaulted with constant input of information, senses, everything. So it also helps us with limited information, fill in the blanks. So something like what I just described may happen very quickly. Or let's go back to our fire alarm example. Let's say you're in the classroom and the fire alarm goes off every Monday. So, it goes off again on a Monday, and maybe you don't get too excited this time because your experience has told you this is just a drill, right? So again, it helps us with limited information make sense out of what's happening around us. But if our models are too rigid and too strong, that can be, so there's a plus that we just described, which helps us break through everything around us and make sense out of what's happening. But the negative part is if they're too rigid or negative or misapplied, then they can obstruct our ability to make good choices, decisions, or accurate perspectives. Okay, so I have this little short video that I think it would be fun for you to watch. I can go ahead and play it. We can see if it works. My bandwidth isn't that great, but shall we try it? It's also loaded in Canvas. So let's take a look there, actually. Hold on just one sec. I'm going to go to a new place here. After all that clicking again, my apologies. Okay, so here we are on our homepage. If you go to modules, scroll, you can see how fast mine is. Scroll down to week 2, click on class session video, PowerPoint, and resources. Now you can see, obviously, today's session is blank because we're still doing it. If you scroll down, here's where you can play this. Will you go ahead and do that right now, and then we'll chat about it briefly? Is that okay? I'm going to go let some people into the class. Okay. So will you guys let me know when you're done, either thumbs up or something in the chat maybe?
So why do optical illusions work?
Oh, whoops, sorry about that.
In this video, we'll be looking at another one.
Okay. Oh, goodness, we have more people joining us. Hang on.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Want everybody to join in as much as possible. Okay. So welcome to our new folks. All right. So after watching the video, what did you guys think? Did you watch it?
Well, I think I didn't, but I just
I
came
love
here.
your
So
honesty.
I'm like halfway through.
Oh, Jason, you are such a favorite. You are so honest. I loved it. Okay. What did I bring you in too early, Charles? Oh, okay. We're still watching. Sorry about that.
I just got access to the class now, so I don't know what we're doing.
So, oh, okay. Go
Yeah,
to.
I was sitting in the queue for like 15 minutes.
Oh, no. Well, I kept going in and out. I apologize for that. If you go to Canvas, week 2, and click on, class session video and resources, there is a video like a few minutes long to watch. It looks like that.
Okay.
So when I think it's conversation.
Thank you, Fro. Fro put it in the chat. That is really nice of you. I should have done that. Love it when a plan comes together, right, guys? Hi, Allie. I thought you were already here. My apologies if I missed you.
No, it's all good.
oh, that's tricky. You showed this one in a different class too.
I did. I showed it in a management class, Jason.
Yes, I was in that class.
Yeah, so see, you didn't even need to watch it a second time, did you? All right. Yeah, I hear you on the technical difficulties, by the way, so no worries. Okay, thoughts, comments on that?
Oh man.
Yeah, so yeah, good point, Zach. So Zach's talking about the fact that our brains process information based on different, information can actually trick our brains, or maybe our brains. So what, I don't know if you want to explain a little bit more. So reality is based on our perception, right? So if we perceive something and think it looks different, interpret it differently. I like this one better than some of the other examples where they show you pictures and is this line longer than that one, that sort of thing, because it really does take us back to, the illusion, and that, reality is in the eye of the beholder, right?
Exactly.
Mhm. Yes. So thank you for that, Zach. So he's saying, everybody can perceive the information slightly differently based on, what they think. So I talk a lot with students about proofreading their written work. And one of the things that I recommend often is that you read it out loud, because a lot of times when we've been busy writing, we go to proofread it and our brain sees what it knows should be there rather than what is actually there. So another trick is to set it aside, pick it up the next day, which doesn't work very well if the assignment's due at midnight and it's 11 o'clock at night. So that's, reading out loud can disrupt that. But again, the brain is expecting something, and so you miss the typo, right? So by the way, that's not a bad explanation if a teacher points that out to you, right? You can say, hey, I learned in org behavior that this is not my fault. All right. Okay.
They'll accept that, do you think?
Well, I don't think Lori would, but
No.
you know,
Well, in this city,
she's such a stickler for, you know, writing, isn't she? Okay, sorry about that. We digress, everybody. Okay, so another, when we think about perception, another aspect of this is what we call stereotyping. So, you know, it's about, you know, assigning, you know, certain traits to, you know, different, what we see in front of us and whether or not we think that, you know, it's a good thing or not a good thing, right? So we ascribe certain traits to a group, members within a certain group or category, and that can be social. But for instance, as an instructor, I might attribute different characteristics to a freshman student than I would a senior student. Maybe, maybe not. Yes. And so, you know, Zach's pointed out preconceived notions are another way of describing stereotypes, right? And I think that when we stereotype, though, we're also applying it to a group. So we see, so I might say everybody who wears orange is a bad person because that's Oregon State colors and I'm a Duck fan, right? So I might ascribe that. I might have a negative connotation, but then I take it a step farther and I ascribe it to everybody who wears orange, right? Not just the person in front of me. But you know, stereotypes are not all bad. Can you guys think of an instance where it might serve you to have stereotypes in place?
Walk into a bank asking for a loan wearing a tie.
Sure. Or a job interview, maybe,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Yeah. And Zach brought up stranger danger again, right? Which I'd mentioned. Sure. If somebody pulls a gun on you, are you going to stereotype that into a group of danger? Yeah, probably, you know. Or if, you know, you you open your door to your home and somebody punches you in the face, and that person keeps showing up, and every time you open the door they punch you in the face, pretty soon you're going to assume that you're going to ascribe that to that person and anybody who looks like him, and maybe characteristics of that individual. You know, you may broaden out what you perceive. And so it also helps us get through a lot of stuff out there. This is kind of similar to mental models. This is a type of creating those mental models. So, you know, you could stereotype that, you know, people who, you know, follow the law are good citizens. People who break the law tend to have criminal behavior, right? It's just a way of categorizing and how it affects you can help you kind of sort through. If I see somebody approach me and they are, so I used to work in healthcare, as most of you know. And so if a physician walked into a patient's room, or somebody walked in wearing a white lab coat, they would assume that's probably a physician or at least a medical caregiver. Or if they were wearing scrubs, they would make that assumption. And that would be a pretty good guess. If I walk in a business suit, they're going to assume I'm part of administration. And that would be probably a good guess. But is it always correct? Not necessarily. So we have to be careful not to be rigid and not to make too many assumptions. Where we get into trouble is when we stereotype too much, too far, or it's very negative and inappropriate. So you just like me saying everyone who wears orange is a bad person. I don't like them, right? So so another aspect, and this all works with management and also leading people in your organization and interacting with people on your team. So it works with coworkers, managers, leaders, up and down the chain of command. So I find the attribution process a really interesting one. So it's sort of a dichotomy. If you attribute something to an internal source, you would say that whatever that person's behavior, it's caused by their own motivation or ability. If it's an external one, you say it's caused by something beyond their control. So if, let's say I show up every week 5 to 10 minutes late to class. So many of you might say, well, that Lori, she's so disorganized and she's always late. And so,
Sorry.
what was that, Jason?
I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, I know you personally would not jump to that conclusion, right? But some of you might say, well, maybe she has a meeting right before this and it's with her boss and she can't leave on time and they sometimes keep her, right? So who knows? So when managers think about this a lot, when somebody shows up, say late for work, what's interesting is the research in organizations shows us that when we show up late for work or do something that is, not as acceptable, we ascribe it to an external source or cause. If our coworker or employee shows up late or it displays behavior that's less than acceptable, we assume that they're disorganized, lazy, don't care, have a crappy attitude. Isn't that interesting? So we cut ourselves slack, but we immediately blame the other person that they can control it. So, and you're gonna also do an exercise. It looks like some of you may have already done it on locus of control. That is a little bit related to this. So another powerful tool is this idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So think of it as maybe the Pygmalion effect, right? Some of you may be familiar with it. So as a supervisor, you form certain expectations about an employee. They may be correct, they may be incorrect. So your expectations may be the person's lazy, the person is sloppy, or the person is an excellent employee, or they're highly organized or whatever. So those expectations from others affect that person's behavior, right? So if our expectations are manifest about our supervisor, we might expect then our supervisor to behave, or about the employee, we would expect our supervisor to behave differently between those two groups of people. So if the supervisor expects sloppy behavior, they are going to ride that person more even before they see results than they would if they expect excellent behavior, right? And then their behavior affects the employee. So think about, and we see this in parenting too, right? When you tell another person, whether it's a child or an employee or a coworker or whatever, that they can't do something or they're terrible at something over and over and over again, they begin to internalize that and believe it, and it affects how they see themselves and their ability. Likewise, if you keep telling that person, you can do this, you just need to try again, keep at it, then they begin to, have more confidence and do that. So then what we see is, whether it's good or bad, that employee's behavior begins to match those expectations. I've been a parent, and I've seen this time and time again in families, but I've also seen this in the classroom as well. So if that we can have a positive effect on people's outcomes. Now, what if the person is lazy? Now that's a whole different, or Lazy is a poor choice of words because we're really interested in their performance. If their work performance is subpar, we have to figure out why. It could be that they just don't want to be there, they're not interested, but it could also be they don't have training or whatever. And so we talk a lot about that in places like human resource management class. So our perception of other people is really complicated. First of all, we start out as unique humans with our unique experiences, value systems, cultural identity, social identity, everything, right? And then we build upon that. So this is something that also, if you've been in HR class, we talk a lot about this when it comes to performance evaluations or even interviewing process. And those are these errors, these assumptions that we jump to as people in an organization and how we perceive other people. So the first one is called the halo or horn effect. That means that's the example that I gave about people wearing orange is a perfect example. You see one prominent aspect of this person, whether it's a characteristic, a trait, or how they dress, whatever, and you ascribe an overall view to that person. So as Jason pointed out, if you show up in a tie or very well dressed to say an interview, that employer, the interviewer may think, okay, this guy is professional, or gal, this person is professional, they're taking the interview seriously, they want the job, etc. Right? So, but the halo or horn effect really becomes a problem when it's like you see just this one aspect. Like maybe I'm a fan of a certain baseball team, and then all of a sudden you love me, you want to work with me, right? So the primacy effect is our first impression. Now, we've heard over and over again, at least many of us have, that first impressions are really, really important. So when you go for that interview, that first impression, you want to make a good one, right? Well, there's a reason for that. Because of this thing we call first impressions, people have difficulty breaking out of their initial impression of somebody. So there's a reason why we dress and act slightly differently in an interview or a first date or that kind of thing, because we want to make a very good first impression, because first impressions last. And an example of how this can be detrimental, I interviewed an individual for a job at the clinic where I was an administrator, and she had trouble making eye contact. I would ask her a question, she'd give me 1 or 2 word answers. She didn't smile. And I'm thinking, okay, like we work with people here and there's a problem. But then I thought, okay, maybe she's just nervous. So I set aside my first impression and I began doing things that I thought would help her become more comfortable and engaging more. And pretty soon she opened up and I realized this is an incredibly bright, talented person. And I ended up hiring her and I put her in a back office job that had nothing to do with direct patient contact, right? And she was one of our best employees. But if I had gone on my first impression, I would have dismissed her immediately. And the truth was, she was incredible. She was very, very shy. She was just really shy. But when she felt comfortable and got to know people, she was fine. So we have to be careful about our first impressions. And then particularly in performance evaluations, I don't know about you guys, but when I've been evaluated in the past, a lot of times you hear everything about what happened in the last couple of weeks of the year, not all year long. And that's what we call the recency effect. And so then it dominates your overall perception and how you view that person and what you put on their performance evaluation. There's a reason. Go ahead, Jason.
Sorry, but this has been a plague throughout most of my career in various different places. It's always the last couple of weeks, and they always feel like they need to put on something to help you grow somehow. And when they leave or move on, and the other supervisor sees that thing that they added to help you grow and improve, they take it as a negative instead of that this is where you can improve kind of a thing. They think of it as a failing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just like, I don't understand why they do that. Why can't it just be an honest review?
So, I always talk about, in all my classes, I talk about, particularly management and leadership, what is and what should be are not often the same thing, right? So when I talk about exemplary managers, I'm not talking about the average manager out there. And I would suggest that most supervisors are not well trained. They're shortcuts. It's somebody who was really good at a particular job, so they put him in charge of the other people who did the same job with no real training. And it's a shortcut. And the other thing I think, and this is, I don't know how the rest of you feel like this, but I think that when people are thrown into their first management or lead position, they don't know what to do because they haven't been properly onboarded with it or trained. So what do? They think back to what it was like when they were an employee in that position and how their boss or lead person acted, and they emulate that. So we have this perpetuation of very poor practice. That's my long answer, right? So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, the short answer is break the mold when you get out there.
Actually, I was in a supervisory position,
Mm-hmm.
and I did try to break the mold, but my superiors would not let me write a review that was exemplary for an exemplary employee. I had to always put in something of a negative, and even though I have documentation all to the positive.
That makes me crazy. Makes me really, really crazy. So, okay, I'm going to share something with you. You'll hear from me in HR class if you attend that. And so you'll already know the answer. So when I ask this question, don't answer it.
Yes,
but if we set goals for people and we set them together and they're good stretch goals and they accomplish those and they do everything we ask, why would you give them less than a superior rating if they're meeting everything you've asked? So now if you're giving them average goals and your expectation is they're not going to perform at a high level, that's different. But if you're saying, here's exactly what you need to be doing, and like increase whatever by 10% or, make new client, whatever, and they do it, why would you knock them down? So most students will do exactly what you said, Jason. They will do that. They will give the person something to work on. And so my thing is, I take a poll, and when they say that and that wins the poll, I tell them no one in the class gets an A because I'm going to give them something to work on.
right.
And how do you feel about that, guys? Right? Yes. Yeah. So that's yeah. So if you're not watching the chat, it's always a good thing to watch the chat because we've got some good stuff going on over there. And I encourage you guys to constantly think back to how you felt, where you were when you were in the position of the people that you are now leading or supervising. And, the goal is to have a high level of performance, right? So are happy employees more likely to perform at a higher level or unhappy employees? I can tell you what the research shows.
I'm going with happy employees and more productive.
Yeah. There's a direct and positive correlation. So I apologize because all of these areas are related: management, leadership, human resource management, all of that. But again, if you think about all of us coming together in an organization to accomplish something, and we have all this other stuff going on, we aren't even communicating well yet because we haven't even gotten to communicating. We're still dealing with our perception, which is, it's just going to get more and more complicated. So the last one I love, it's called false consensus effect. So, which by the way, if you're interviewing for a job, works really, really well, because a lot of managers overestimate the extent to which if you appear to nod a lot and agree in an interview, they assume you're just like them. And most of us really like ourselves, or we're comfortable with ourselves. So we tend to hire people who are similar or who we think are similar that we'll get along with. So, again, it's about opening yourself up. So some mental models are very helpful. Rigid ones are not. So it's very experiential in how we get better at doing this, right? But another example I have is I used to have a physician. He was new. He was fresh out of training. And he'd been with us for about 6 months. And I started to get employees who came in and say to me, and including his nurse, who would say, I don't think Dr. So-and-so likes me. I'm like, really? Why not? He never talks to me. I say good morning to him and he doesn't respond. I say, how you doing? He doesn't respond. And they all kept saying the same thing. So I'm observing. So anyway, I had a chat with them. I'm like, hey, what's the deal if I come, when employees are thinking that you maybe don't like him? He goes, why? And I said, well, you never talk to them and you never smile. And he said, I'm just really shy. And I said, okay, you don't need to talk to them. Just meet their eyes and crack a small smile or nod and smile. And he started doing, he goes, okay, I can do that. So he started doing that. And one by one, the employees came in and said, I was all wrong. Forget what I said. I think Dr. So-and-so is a great guy. And I think we're getting along fine. A smile and eye contact. So think about how powerful some of this stuff is, right? Okay, enough of all that. Okay, your turn. Okay, this is kind of a fun exercise. I don't think I've done this in any of my classes so far. So I want you to read this, and then I am going to give you a short little quiz. So if you have either something like your phone or your computer that you can, I'm going to give you a few questions, true, false, that you can keep track of your answers, or a piece of paper or something. I want you to do that, okay? So go ahead and can everybody see the screen, or is some of you on the phone? Is anybody on the phone? If you're on the phone, I'll read it to you. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Allie. All right, go ahead and take a look. Read carefully, because you're not going to see this again. Okay, ready? Okay, here you go. Here are your 10 questions. These are true, false, or you're unsure. Let me move that. There you go. Yeah, we're not turning anything in, Brian. I'm going to show you the answers, but I want you to keep track so that you have an idea of how observant you are and your mental models and your ideas, okay? How you doing? Can you give me either a thumbs up or something in the chat when you're all done? Okay, a couple more seconds. You don't want to think too much about this. You just want to do it. Okay. I'm thinking that I'm going to throw you in some groups. And so that you guys, since we're a really big group here, there's 28 of you. So I'm going to put you in smaller groups of 4 or 5. And I want you guys to compare your answers, okay? And then when we come back, let me know how many, how close you guys were, if you agreed, disagreed, and then vote on what you think should be the final answer, okay? And then come back when you're done, or if I don't hear from you soon, I'll bring you back. Okay, I'm gonna pause the recording. Don't let me forget to start it again. Okay, so how did we do? All right, so let's start by getting your answer to see. First of all, for each of the groups, were you fairly similar in what you thought? And or did you find that you came to better answers with more input?
Yeah, I think they were more or less on track. There was only like 1 or 2 questions that could be debated, but I think everyone was kind of on par with it.
Okay.
In our group, I feel like there's kind of a few questions that either like one of us had different or a few of us had different. So we had a few that we like had undecided.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, thank you, Fro. So she's saying that, people definitely, having more memories put together, more brains helped, because you may have noticed something somebody else didn't notice, that kind of thing. So, all right. Any other comments or thoughts on that? Okay, all right. Let's take a look here. 1 second. Let me get out of where I am. Okay, so are you ready for the answers? Like drum roll.
Hit me.
There they are. Okay, the first one, right? How many of the groups had true for number 1?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody disagree? Number 2 is true. The professor with the light. Can't read my writing. I wrote them down and now I can't read my writing.
I think number 1 was the person who picks up the exam after the door is closed.
So number 1 is the thief was tall, dark, and broad, right? And
Yeah.
that was true. Number 2 is the professor turned off the light. That was true.
Right.
Tall figure demanded the examination. That was correct.
True.
Examination was picked up by someone. Correct. The examination was picked up by the instructor. False. Okay, the dark figure appeared after the professor turned off the light. False. The man opened the drawer. Who opened the drawer was the professor. True. Professor ran down the corridor. Okay, false. The drawer was never actually opened. False. 3 people are referred to in this case.
True.
True.
I was just like, I might have been thinking about it too hard, but for examination picked up by the instructor and professor ran down the corridor, in both those cases, it just says it was picked up. It didn't specify. So I don't think it could be true or false. So wouldn't unsure work a little bit better there?
Very likely, yes.
Because it
very
said
likely.
individual and ran down the corridor, and then the examination was picked up. So
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think, so I personally would definitely think that was a possibility for sure. Yeah. So the idea is that sometimes when we're, like in this case, reading a scenario, we begin to make assumptions based on what we're reading already. And it's kind of like when you're in a conversation with somebody and you're already formulating your answer to what they're saying before they finish saying it. So sometimes that works, sometimes not so well, right? Okay, so according to the source where I took this from, which is another textbook, if you got 8 out of 10 correct, you are an active listener, or in our case, an active reader. Okay, and if you got less than 5, maybe you need to be a little more attentive. So normally, it might be interesting to see what would happen if you couldn't read it, if you could only hear it once and see, right? That might be a lot more difficult, right?
Telephone game?
Pardon?
A telephone game?
Yes, something like that. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, so the other thing that you're going to spend some time looking at in the chapters is, the concept of learning. And think about this in organizations. We're, always learning as we go along, right? Now, I just want to make sure you're seeing that on the screen. Are you seeing my screen?
no.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right, let me share that with you so it will make more sense. Did you see the questions when I was sharing them?
No,
I
it
think
was just you
not.
reading them.
Okay, that's why it was a little more difficult. Okay, my apologies. So this is what you should have seen. And then I just kept going back and forth like that. So my apologies. Okay, you guys are so polite. Please don't hesitate if you think you're hearing something that maybe I should know about, right? Okay, so learning. So this is how we think about learning. And so it's a change in behavior or the tendency to behave differently, right? As a result of when it says a person's interaction with the environment. So the environment can be experiential, it could be reading, it could be a class, it could be a group of people, it could be any source of media, it could be anything, any experience that you're having that you change how you're going to act based on how you're learning. So, we're constantly changing. We're constantly learning and changing and adapting. And a lot of it is very iterative. It's very minuscule. And so we're not even really aware of it all the time as we go through that process. But we can use this idea in helping people modify their behavior at work so that we are able to encourage the behavior we want to see and discourage the behavior we don't want to see. Okay. So that's just a way of us, as the screen says, maximizing positive and minimizing negative consequences or outcomes. So, so this is kind of interesting when it says, learning is viewed as completely dependent on the environment. So in other words, you're interacting with some sort of stimulus when we talk about behavior modification, and that it's that part of the act of behaving and the interaction that is an underpinning for what we call behavior modification. So this is a chart. I think I took this actually from your textbook, or similar one. But so we have this chart of what we call the ABCs of behavior modification. Now, those of you who are psych majors are, I'm sure, or have had some intro to psych classes are pretty familiar with all of this. So, you know, we start with, okay, things as they are. So what happens before the behavior? Then when the person acts, what do they say or do? And then what happens afterwards? So at some point, if we want to alter that, we may make a difference, right? So here's the example. You know, you're working on machinery and a warning light comes on. So you immediately turn off the power and you get positive reinforcement for that, right? So that is an example, a very simplistic example of what that would be like. So here's a bit more self-explanatory type of chart. So in the workplace, we want to change behavior. So we think of some sort of stimulus for this work behavior. So we want people to come to work on time, right? So we have two groups of people in the workplace, those who are consistently on time and those who are consistently late. So what are we going to do with each of those groups to ensure that everybody comes to work on time? So obviously the people who are coming to work on time, we could positively reinforce them doing that and do it in a way that they will want to continue doing it. So here a recommendation might be merit increase, pay increase. That would be a positive reinforcement. Now, and this is kind of my favorite, when you have an employer who just rails on everybody because 10% is coming in late, so all they do is harass everybody. That's not a very positive environment, right? Or culture for work. But for the people who are coming on time, we, instead of praising them and being, you know, offering them something, we could just avoid harassing or reprimanding them, right? So that we call that avoidance learning, because instead of hollering at them along with everybody else, we don't do that. So for those who come in late, we could try to stop it by withholding praise and not giving them merit increases, but they'll see others are getting them, right? Or we can actually punish, and we see more punishment, I think, than my experience in the workplace, because people think carrot and stick. They think positive reinforcement or punishment. They don't think of the ones in between, right? And so you reprimand, and it says harass employees, but so have you all worked in environments where a supervisor or lead person or boss consistently just complains to the whole group about a behavior that is of a smaller percentage of the group?
Well, you've heard some of my stories, so.
Yes. Okay. How you guys doing? You seem a little bit quiet today, and that's okay. That's okay. Maybe a chance to do some more chatting among yourselves, which I think is helpful. So one of my favorite theories about learning in some sort of environment, whether it's an organization or a social group or whatever, is the social learning theory. And this is where we observe and model the behavior of others. So think about this for a minute. You're among a work group, and a member of your group continually gets praised, and then they get promoted and moved on. So you might think, okay, I should figure out what they were doing that deserved this thing that I want, which is I want praise, and I would like to be promoted. So we begin to model ourselves after somebody who has those kinds of results that we aspire to, right? So we observe and then we model. So it's not that we're necessarily. I mean, you can ask questions and that kind of thing, but it's a bit more passive than what we think. And I think many of us do that from a very early age in our peer groups. We learn, you know, if we want to be liked, which most humans do, that we figure out, you know, those who are popular or well liked or always chosen for team, what is it they're doing differently that we might want to emulate? And sometimes that's not necessarily good, right? It could be, so you want to be a good consumer of you know, input as well, to make sure that, for instance, if somebody's getting promoted because they're cheating, you have to decide, okay, am I going to be ethical and not cheat, or am I going to cheat and be promoted? Okay. So the one thing that you can do, you can only control your own behavior. You can't control the behavior of your boss. So for instance, so that is social learning theory, and a very sort of newer concept in organizations, particularly companies, for-profits, is what we call the learning organization. You may have stumbled on this in maybe management class. So a learning organization typically comes with a more organic, flatter type of organization. So this is one in which employees are highly valued, and there's an emphasis on acquiring knowledge and constantly improving employees, you know, knowledge base and skill level and that kind of thing, which also improves the performance within the organization, right? And so a learning organization can be really positive if it's constantly helping self-improvement, right? And so for instance, in a learning organization, when a mistake happens, we don't automatically blame. We look at the error and say, what could we have done differently? And we learn from the mistake. And that becomes an exchange, and it happens at an organic level. So for instance, if I had a bad outcome, a patient complained about something that happened when they were in the office, I might sit down with the group and say, okay, this patient had a complaint. So what transpired? Is this legitimate? What should we have done differently? Could we have done something differently? Or maybe the patient asked us to do something that we have a rule against doing, but maybe we need to explain it better. So it again happens organically, and learning happens in the trenches. So it's not a top down where the people at the top they know they're all wise and they push that information down. It's learning from the bottom up and learning from your interaction with customers, clients, patients, whatever that is, right? Or from each other. Okay. So I want you guys to think, we've talked a lot, or I've talked a lot today about, you know, these these feelings and behaviors that occur inside an organization as humans come together to try to accomplish something. And how we handle all of this really results in the type of culture we create in our organization. And that's what I'm talking about here. So thinking about some of the things that either you've read about or you've heard here today, and then thinking about your work experience or your experience in school or on sports teams or volunteering, you know, any organization that you've been part of. So how could think of a time, maybe an organization that you're maybe a customer of even, that appears to have positive work attitudes. How is that created and maintained? So if you're a culture creator, thinking of all these things, what sorts of things should occur? And, you know, related to that is then that translates into how can managers and organizations develop a committed workforce? Okay, so I'm going to put you back in your groups, okay? Any questions on this? I just want you guys to kick this around. I'm going to pop in and out. Just kind of see how people are doing and answer any questions that you might have. Okay, somebody is not assigned to a group. I'll figure that out. Oh, okay. Tiana, I'm going to put you in a group here. Okay. I'll put you in room 6. You should get an invitation. Love Zach's comment. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording here. Okay, so what did you come up with? So does somebody want to start us off from their group?
Sure. I think we came to the consensus that it needs to start at the top, and every link down the chain needs to have it impressed upon them to carry through what kind of work environment that the company wants to foster. Starts with the CEO, it moves to the vice presidents, the vice presidents take it to the managers take it to the supervisors, and the supervisors take it to the employees.
Can you create a positive environment or culture from the bottom up?
And that's where we were getting into the downer side that I was talking about before, because my experience says no.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll ask some of the other groups. How's that?
Yeah. Okay. Let's go that way.
Okay. What did some of the other of you come up with?
I think if everyone went into a job without expecting people to be friends with them, because they don't have to be, sometimes that leads to issues, especially if you're just there to work. So while bottom up, it might be difficult, I think there's more strain on management-esque stuff, because it's a company and the goal of a company is to make money, and depending on how they interact with your employees, whether it's a toxic work environment because, we need to make money. I don't care if you're sick. You only get a week off a year, that sort of thing. So there definitely needs to be a culture change if there's ever going to be any uplifting work environments, because they're few and far between as it is.
So did your group discuss, do you have to be friends to have a positive work environment?
No, it was just a little offhand thing, but I kind of
Mhm.
wanted to bring it up again because I went in a job and you do your usual razzing and to see what kind of person you are, and then everyone just forms their cliques,
Yeah.
so you don't have to be friends with every clique. Just
Mhm.
you're there to work, find your
Wow.
compatible co-workers, I guess, and
Hmm.
you'll get by. As long as everyone's amicable to each other, I guess, is kind of the only thing.
Well, that would be good. That would be good if everybody was. Yeah. Okay. What else? Who else? Yeah. Okay, Jason, what?
I didn't want to interject too much, but
That's right.
it didn't come up in our group, that last thing, but you don't necessarily have to be friends with everybody, but politeness goes a very long way. Politeness
Yeah.
and professionalism goes a very
Yeah.
long way.
Yeah,
I think
I'd
we
agree
need
with that.
Yeah.
Dylan, what would you like to add?
I think the general consensus our group kind of came to was that you can kind of create a positive work environment just through personal connections with your colleagues. I mean, you're there for however many hours they're together. I mean, why not kind of get to know them or find out how they are, what their life is like, to kind of
Mhm.
foster something yourself. If management is lacking or somebody else is lacking, kind of take it into your own hands.
So that's actually a really important point. And because we know that humans are social creatures and that we crave interactions and connectivity with other humans. And I remember I'd hired a billing person for our group. And, we chat, we would chat. I would chat with everybody. I was always out on the floor. And people would begin to share some, things about themselves or their families, right? And she had 2 grandkids, and she talked about always her beach house and that kind of thing. And so one day she said, "Hey, yeah, I'm going to the beach this weekend, and the grandkids are coming down." And I'm like, "Oh, is your daughter Susan coming?" And she looked at me and she goes, "You know my daughter's name?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you talk about her all the time." And she said, "I worked in my last place 10 years and talked the same way. And my boss never knew that." And it had such a huge impact. And I thought, wow, how sad is that, right? But that's that thing about having some sort of connection. Yeah, I think it's important. And we don't have to pry, and we don't have to share things we don't want to. So, Taylor, why don't you add to the conversation?
Yeah, our group had like 2 main points that we all kind of agreed on. So one of them was being able to take accountability. So if you make a mistake, being able to own up to it, but then also your boss, being able to own up to their mistakes and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I messed up." And we'll all be taking the blame for this together. It's not just you, and they don't try to put the blame onto other people. It's being able to take accountability for your own actions. And then the other part of it too is not, even, and this may be coming from like a nonprofit perspective, but like, we all kind of work together on all of our stuff, even though we all have our own different programs. Like if one of us is struggling, everyone will kind of step in to help out. And like, even my bosses saw me struggling this week to make a deadline. I asked them to extend it. They said, "No, you're not going to extend it, but we'll help you." And so having my executive director and my operations director step up and help me, even though I'm at a lower stance than them, like it means a lot coming from like, from corporate work where they would just give you a task. And if you didn't get it done, it was like, "Oh, well, that's on you. It's a write-up now." They said, "Okay, let's get this all done together and we'll come help you and we'll make sure it gets done."
That's really powerful, that kind of gesture. And I think that accountability happens when you have trust. You have to have trust to have accountability, and trust that you're not going to get yelled at, that the goal is to solve the problem, right? So instead of assessing blame, we solve the problem. Now, some of you are probably thinking, "Well, I worked with this guy. He was such a jerk. He never did anything." That's a separate thing. That's a discipline issue, and that needs to be taken care of. And I'm all about doing that. But in general, what you're talking about, Taylor, is really, really important. And if you are in an environment where it's going to be looked at like, I used to tell people, if you hide that you're behind in your work, I will never know when to add another employee. I won't know when we've gotten busy enough that we need to add another person. So we have to talk, we have to know, and we have to help each other out. So, yeah. But what do the rest of you think? Is that a common practice in the workplaces you've been?
Not for me, at least. I mean, I've always worked like corporate, retail jobs. And then once I got into the nonprofit world, it was a whole different ball game and a whole different story. It felt like, like it's the same for every program. Like if someone's struggling in Exodus House, like they'll be like, "Oh, you need to go work there for a minute. That way we get it covered." And so it's very teamwork. And I think part of it is because it's nonprofit and, we have a very limited staff, there's not a bunch of coverage. So we all step in to, help each other out. But it definitely makes for a better work environment and puts a lot of stress off of my shoulders and off of everyone else's shoulders if we all come together and do it together.
Sure. And you know what? If that boss, supervisor, corporate person asked for your help down the road with something that was important, you're probably going to be there, right? Because you're a team, right? That's again, that's a really powerful thing, because what that person's saying is, we're all in this trying to accomplish the goal and then figure out how we can do it better going forward. So excellent. Yeah, I like that a lot. Okay, what about, and of course we saw Jason's tears when we asked. What do the rest of you think? What did the other groups come up with?
Well, we had more or less what everyone else has said, although we kind of emphasized a bit more on having that
you know, we kind of simplified it a bit. Don't be a jerk, and have an environment where that's not really acceptable to be a jerk. But additionally, you know, as you said, if the manager or the, you know, the executive level people will come down and help you out, then when they may need help, or if they have something that, you know, if they're going to ask you to work a little bit late on in a project to get it done, you know, you don't feel resentful really, you know, or you're much less likely to, because you have that sense of we're in it together, you know, even at the higher levels.
And so, you know, when you guys think, if any of you think about starting your own business, I don't know how many of you aspire to that, but, you know, starting out with a positive culture and keeping it that way is so incredibly important, because it's really hard to change once a culture is embedded. And so what happens when it becomes toxic, what happens is that you have managers who ignore, right? And they don't hold people accountable. And it becomes more toxic because a small percentage of people feel like they're doing all the work. What happens as the environment becomes more and more toxic is that the people who have all the talent, they leave because they can get other jobs. And you're stuck with people who are average or below average, or worse yet, you're stuck with people who are toxic because they're comfortable in a toxic environment. So all it does is make it worse and worse and worse. And so it's a really bad downhill slide. Yeah. Does somebody have their hand up? Sorry, there's a lot of you. I'm trying to keep an eye on everybody. So,
No,
okay.
but
Yeah.
I did have one thing. You had said earlier, is it possible to make a positive work environment from the bottom up?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this was like a good way to go about it, but I know one job I worked, the management was really toxic and pretty poor. And so that caused for a lot of unity among the employees. And so we actually had a pretty fun time. It was like walking through hell with your best friends, you know? So
Mm-hmm.
we actually made some pretty lasting friendships, and because it was such a terrible work environment that we learned to get through it together. So there's one way we managed to make a positive out of a pretty poor situation.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, Walker, because we have seen in our, you know, when we, do research inside organizations, that number one reason, if you look at the human resource research, number one reason people leave jobs, their immediate supervisor. Number one reason. But one of the reasons people stay are their coworkers, and what you talk about, that feeling of unity and collaboration among each other. You become almost like a little family unit and depend on each other. What happens is if one person leaves, then that breaks that all apart and others start to tumble after it. It's like, well, if that person could leave, maybe I could too. Yeah. So let me take a look at what, yes. Taylor, that's a really good point. Those are the kinds of jobs you reminisce on, but never go back to. Yeah, because you miss the people. But a toxic environment can take a huge toll. Yeah, Kenneth? You're muted. Go ahead.
So yeah, to add on to that, that sense of unity can also promote action, I believe, to even create change, and that it can actually, like going back to that question, can you promote it from the bottom up or fix it from the bottom up? That's another way that it can happen.
Yeah. So I worked in organizations where if you have a department where the performance is up, people are happy, other people and the organization as a whole is toxic, other people want to get into your department and no one leaves your department. And you sort of get a reputation. And then pretty soon, if your performance, as you say, is rising or better, and you're coming up with improved processes, people start to notice because you're making the boss look good. And so it's like, okay, what's going on here? I think a really tough place to be is if you're a frontline supervisor and you have a toxic boss that you work for, and you have to stop that and not let it roll downhill to your people, which is really hard. But so you can make your little unit a happy place to work, or a productive, positive place within a toxic organization. Unfortunately, supervisors in that role burn out pretty fast because they're taking all the crap from above and they're trying their darndest not to pass it on and instead do something positive. That's really, really hard. But I mean, it can be done, but really for a pretty short period of time, I think. Good comments, you guys. Anything else? What, any other groups want to add to this? Nope. Okay. All right. So let's move on and take a look here at, you know, more of this kind of the types of things that are not, you know, concrete, right? The intangibles in a workplace. That's what we're really talking about. But they have a lot to do with how we interact and that kind of thing, and how we feel about the location and the place where we are. So are you, I'm gonna share my screen again here. I'm not sure it's being shared. Sorry, I lost track of what you were looking at. So this thing, so we have looking at the difference between attitudes towards something and emotions. So attitudes are pretty more embedded. They're something that stays with us. It's something that's you know, longer term, and that we kind of rely on to make assessments. And so think about your attitude towards a particular food, right? It may be positive, maybe negative. It doesn't really change based on your a whim, right? So attitudes are judgments. So it has a cognitive part to it as well. And so you're looking at something, you're assessing, you're making a judgment, and then that becomes your belief about either a thing or a person or an action or behavior. Emotions, on the other hand, are more fleeting, right? They're more in the moment, and they're you know, based on, you know, it's a reaction, and we learn how to respond to certain things, right? So if somebody yells at us, we might yell back, or we might feel, we maybe have emotion of feeling bullied, or if somebody is praising us, we may have a different kind of emotion. We may feel really positive and that kind of thing. So, but emotions are more fleeting, but they can affect, a lot of emotion can, over time, can affect our attitudes, and our attitudes really affect our behavior. So another intangible that you'll see in the workplace is this thing we call cognitive dissonance. So this is the type of environment where you are asked or required to do something that is in direct opposition to your values or what you think is right or correct. So in other words, your beliefs or feelings or normal behavior are not consistent with what others are requiring of you. So an example might be, so I had a student who worked at a bank, a commercial bank, and she was on the front line with customers, and she would greet new customers, open accounts, that kind of thing. And so she was like a personal banker for people. And she was required by her bank to cross-sell services, regardless of whether or not she felt people needed them. And so maybe she had a customer who came in, it was an elderly person, they just needed a checking account to have, you know, like Social Security or something deposited into. And she got in trouble for not asking them to open up a credit card and a bunch of other stuff. And her pay, her evaluations, her performance was very tied to that. So they were like keeping statistical track of what she was doing and what she wasn't doing. And that was that. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Zach. Zach goes, it sounds like my job. That flies in the face of your own personal values. So you're being asked to do something at work that is incongruent with what you think is the right thing to do. And you have to make some decisions here. So maybe you're in a job where you need this job. Now what do you do, right? So most people will continue to do that. Another example are call centers, where I don't know if you've heard the old adage in retail in particular, the customer is always right. Well, I'm sorry, the customer is not always right. And, but oftentimes people, particularly in call centers, are having people yell and scream at them and call them names, and they have to be pleasant and agreeable. And that's not, that's a disconnect, right? And it's very stressful and raises people's stress level. So it's expected. So even though we're doing it voluntarily, we're feeling pressured to do it, if that makes sense, right? So it's something we talk about a lot in maybe ethics class, where we look at, or in management class when you're talking about employees and culture and that kind of thing. If you don't have a voice as an employee, that's kind of a problem. And that's part of the positive work environment that we've been talking about. One answer to help us maneuver through all of these connections that we have with other people, whether they are verbal or nonverbal or feelings or the way people act, behaviors, is this thing we call emotional intelligence. So I don't know if you've come across it in your other classes, if possibly in management or leadership class. So it is the ability to perceive, we talked about perception, and express emotion, assimilate emotion in thought, so bringing in a cognitive component, understand and reason with emotion, and regulate your emotion. Okay, what does that mean, right? It's kind of a academic definition. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So we start with self-awareness. If you look at the bottom of the chart that's on the screen, we start with self-awareness. And that's perceiving and understanding what's going on. So how are you feeling and what is happening there, right? And is it an appropriate response? Is it an appropriate emotion? Is it an appropriate feeling? So if I have a fight with one of my kids and I go to work and I yell at an employee and I'm angry at them, was that an appropriate emotion? So probably not. So the next step is to manage our own emotions. So be aware and manage them in the situation and try to be appropriate, right? So then once we're able to do that, the self-awareness and self-management, then we move into a situation where we perceive and observe what's going on with other people. So why are they acting the way they are? So, being socially aware and perceiving that, and then being able to adjust. So think about my example of the doctor that everybody thought didn't like them. And so in a situation like that, they didn't understand the meaning of his emotions and actions at all. But I did, because I knew him better. I had more knowledge. We'd worked behind the scenes a lot together. And so I was able to give him some help in how to do that and to manage his emotions with other people. And so that was kind of an example of that. So when we're talking about managing other people's emotions, we're not talking about doing anything manipulative. It's sort of, think about language. If you guys are, if somebody is in health sciences or technology or engineering and you're using that kind of jargon with me, I have no idea maybe what you're talking about. And you might see the frustration on my face and you might pivot to a simpler dialogue using layman's terms. That's managing the situation. So we're just talking about doing the same thing with emotions. And, you know, I'm sure most, if not all of you have been in a situation where you have no idea why somebody just was in your face with anger. And we immediately assume it's us. We immediately assume it's directed at us, but it might not be. It may have been, you know, the example I use, they may have just come out of a very difficult situation and you were the next thing they ran into. So it's a little bit of learning experience and being in tune and being open and not making those assumptions. So if we take this full circle all the way around where we started in terms of our mental models, you know, we might have a mental model if somebody's yelling at us, they're upset with us for something we've done, but that might not always be the case, right? We don't know. So emotional intelligence is a very important skill to have in the workplace. And in fact, among exemplary leaders, we see many of them have a highly developed emotional intelligence. And that makes sense because their goal is to inspire and encourage people to move together to accomplish something, right? So it is a skill set, and that means we can learn it, we can practice it. And, you know, a good way to do that is if you're in a position to coach other people, like new employees or new members of the group or that kind of thing, you can help with that. And it's very positive that as we mature, our emotional intelligence gets better. Now, it's not a cause and effect thing. This is more longitudinally looking at how people perform over time as they are older. Their emotional intelligence appears to grow and become better. Is that because they've just had more experience, or is there something else that's happening in terms of their maturity that is also occurring at the same time? Or maybe it's, you know, both, all of the above, right? So all of the stuff we've been talking about kind of leads to our second question, or for two questions that you guys just talked about, which is, you know, being satisfied with your work experience and your job. And, you know, job satisfaction is something that we use as a measure to see how well organizations are doing with their employees and as an aspect of culture. It's an outcome we can look at and we can ask people. The only thing about job satisfaction is that it's multifactorial. So like the example that was given where you stay in a crappy job with a toxic environment because your little unit of people you're really close to, and that's a powerful positive of that work experience. So you're satisfied. Your satisfaction comes from that. It doesn't come from the bosses or maybe the work itself. And we see that in healthcare. So for instance, a nurse can work in a very toxic environment. And by the way, hospitals can be really toxic. But her satisfaction or his satisfaction comes with that direct patient care and their craft and job and that they are practicing, right? So job satisfaction is a little bit complicated, but when you boil it all down, it's how people evaluate themselves in the workplace and whether or not it's a positive or a negative. And we think that it's important because it is an antecedent to better work performance. So there are certain things like job satisfaction that as it rises, it correlates with better performance. Same thing with organizational commitment. The more committed you are to the organization and feel positively toward it, we tend to see people with high organizational commitment also have higher levels of performance. No. And organizational commitment also has multi-factors. So there's the emotional attachment with the organization. And then there's a commitment to stay, right? To be a long-term person there. And that, again, that can be because the benefits outweigh the costs, right? And or it could be because this is considered maybe your job is a status thing out in the community, or you get other accolades for holding this position. But a lot of work, my interest in this is more on the affective thing, and I think that ties in a little bit more with what we've been talking about, right? So when you think about an example of somebody who may be very committed to their organization is somebody who wears all their company's logos, right? Or they only drive the car for the company that they make cars for, or whatever. They're very, very tied in and committed to the success of the organization. So if we want to build that emotional support and that emotional commitment, there's some things that we can do here. And I don't think this is going to be a big surprise to any of you. You know, I mentioned trust early on. We know that trust is a huge component. We talk about it a lot now in leadership, how in order to have a trusting and positive work environment, there needs to be one where you're not worried about backlash or negative consequences, that, you know, you trust that it's a fair and just and okay workplace, right? And that you have shared values. Shared values have a lot to do with it. Again, if you think about cognitive dissonance, if your values are in opposition to your employer, that's a problem. And in most cases, I would highly recommend that you look for a different job, because it's only going to be stressful for you. Either you have to change your values, which doesn't usually happen, or you will continually be stressed, and that leads to other issues. And you know, we've also learned that involving people in decision making, and you know, this whole idea of organic organizations where ideas come from the bottom up in terms of improvement and how best to do things is really important. Number one, it helps us adapt and change more quickly. And you know, I always say this: why wouldn't you ask the people who are closest to the customer or the job how to do it better, right? And yes, I think, you know, Zach is putting it pretty succinctly in the chat, which is a supervisor who has their employees back has a good environment there, you know? It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, you know, from time to time, but we need to know that if we falter, there's somebody behind us with their hand out behind us to support us if we're going to fall, not put a knife in our back. Yeah. So these are some of the things that we're going to focus on as we continue reading through our book. So before we kind of sum up what we need to be doing, any last comments, questions, curiosities, thoughts? Okay. If you haven't figured it out, probably you have if you have any work experience. Developing and maintaining a positive work culture is an extremely difficult thing to do. But, you know, I like to ask the question of people, if you have the ability to influence your work environment because you're a lead worker or a supervisor or a boss or somebody or an embed, why would you not want to go to work every day in a place that was positive and even fun? I love fun at work. I used to embed fun at work, even in some of the most trying situations in healthcare. You know, we would see people who are dying, And that takes a toll on your workers. So we had an area where they could go and just act out and do silly things and whatever to release some of that tension. So anyway, organizational behavior is a really fascinating area, and hopefully you will find it to be super interesting as well. Okay, so we are in week 2. You have a couple chapters to read. Don't forget your discussion forum. Thank you for your good work on the discussion forum last week. I really enjoyed reading everybody's introductions, and you guys did a great job of interacting with each other. Oh, interesting. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat again. Oh, okay. So Zach deals with a lot of negative people. Yes, so they try to be positive with each other and play pranks. I agree. So I used to have, I don't know if you've ever seen it. They came out a few years ago, several years ago, maybe. There were these guns that looked like laser shooters, and they would shoot out foam discs or things. And they make sounds when you shoot them. And I kept them in my office. And so people who were getting frustrated could come get them. And as long as they were out of sight from where our, patients or clients or whatever were, they could have shoot 'em up games with each other or take their frustration out on their boss. They could walk in their boss's office and shoot them with the gun, right? And I don't mean that in a violent way, but yeah, pranks and stuff like that, right? So laughing, yeah, Nerf guns, thank you. Laughter is a very positive thing. And I talk about this in BizPres presentations as well. Laughing releases tension. Laughter is a way of letting go of nervous tension as well. And so I don't know about you, but I think laughing is a little bit more fun than crying, but it's all emotion. Okay, so you have your chapters in that, and then you have an assignment. I see that some of you have already been working on it, so thank you for that. It's pretty well self-explanatory in the Canvas description. And then the repeat next week, a couple of chapters, discussion, and another assignment, which I believe is a case study. So if you have questions on any of that, oh my gosh, if you have questions on any of that, just reach out, let me know. I'd love to hear from you, okay? So any last questions, thoughts before I bid you goodbye? And wish you a really good week. Okay, well, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording. And oh, you guys are having fun. If you're not on the chat, check out the chat. Yeah, Charlie.
Oh no, I was just laughing. It's a good one. Psychology is always fun to learn about, but the work one always hits close to everybody, I'm sure.
Yes, and it's okay. So I worked in an industry that had life and death, and it's in pink cowboy hat. It's important to allow people to be themselves and to let loose and to get rid of stuff. And we also had people who would cry together when we lose a patient, and that's okay too. You got to have, again, we are human beings and we're a little bit different. Okay, so I am stopping the recording.